The thing everyone in the colony called a monster was trying its hardest not to hurt anyone. That was the thought that stopped Dr. Ethan Carter cold just outside Isolation Wing C, where the air smelled like antiseptic, overheated wiring, and the sharp metallic tang of sterilizers running too long. Red emergency strips pulsed along the ceiling in slow, steady flashes, painting the polished floor in bands of warning light. Somewhere behind the reinforced glass ahead, a voice rose and fell in a sound that wasn't quite a cry and wasn't quite a machine alarm either, something strained and raw and exhausted enough to make the hair on Ethan's arms lift under his scrub jacket. He had been on shift for almost 19 hours. His coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago. The tablet in his hand still held 3 unsigned discharge summaries and 1 medication correction he hadn't had time to finish. None of that mattered now. 2 security officers in matte black armor stood outside the sealed chamber with the rigid posture of men trying not to look afraid. A nurse Ethan recognized from triage, Mila Brooks, held a scanner so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. "Doctor, don't go in there," she said the second she saw him. Her voice came out lower than normal, as if the room itself required whispering. She spiked again. "Temp is at 103.8, pulse keeps crashing, and the restraints are the only reason this wing is still intact." Ethan stopped at the glass and looked inside. At first all he could make out was reflected light, the ghost of his own tired face layered over a hospital bed bolted to the floor. Then the angle shifted, and he saw her. She was taller than any human woman he'd ever treated, though pain had folded her inward until she seemed smaller somehow, reduced by whatever was happening under that luminous blue-green skin. Faint lines of silver light moved beneath the surface of her arms and throat like bioluminescent currents under deep water. Dark hair, almost black under the red lights, clung to her temples. Her chest rose too fast, then stalled, then rose again in a jagged rhythm that made Ethan's clinical instincts snap awake. This wasn't rage. This was collapse. "What's her name?" he asked. One of the guards gave a humorless laugh. "You didn't read the file." Ethan kept his eyes on the patient. "I asked for her name." Mila swallowed. "They're calling her Valen." "Calling her." "Not is. Not her confirmed identity." Ethan hated that kind of language in a chart. Hated what it meant. On the glass, layers of warning text scrolled in amber: biohazard risk. Contact restriction. Psychic event survivor. Public safety threat. Every few seconds another line flashed across the panel in larger letters: "Do not enter without command authorization." Ethan watched Valen turn her head a fraction toward the sound of voices outside. Even through the distortion of the barrier, he saw the fear in her expression before she buried it. Not the fear of a predator cornered. The fear of someone bracing for what people always did when they saw her. "What happened before she got here?" he asked. "Transport team said there was an incident near the outer settlements," Mila said. "People started panicking the second they saw her. Somebody recognized her species or thought they did. By the time security cleared the hall, half the intake staff were refusing the room." Ethan looked back at the numbers streaming across the monitor feed on the outer console. Blood oxygen unstable. Neural activity erratic. Temperature climbing. Cardiac rhythm irregular in a pattern he didn't recognize but already distrusted. He had spent enough years in emergency medicine to know when a body was telling a different story than the people around it. The story on the glass said threat. The story on the monitor said suffering. Behind the barrier, Valen's fingers curled against the restraint line and then relaxed, as if she were concentrating on staying still through a wave of agony no one in the room could measure correctly. Ethan set his unfinished tablet on a supply cart, reached for the access panel, and heard both guards shift at once. "Doctor," Mila said again, softer now, almost pleading. "Everyone is scared of her." Ethan rested his hand against the cold plate beside the lock and never took his eyes off the patient beyond the glass. "Then everyone," he said quietly, "has had the luxury of not being the one in pain." The lock gave a soft hydraulic click, followed by the low hiss of pressure equalizing through the chamber seams. The sound alone was enough to make both guards tense behind him, but Ethan had already stepped through before either of them could object. The air inside the room felt different from the hallway outside, warmer by a few degrees, close and dry, with the sterile bite of cleaning agents layered over something stranger beneath it, something like rain on hot metal. Valen's eyes found him at once. Up close, the fear people had built around her made even less sense. She did not look dangerous. She looked exhausted. Every line of her body was drawn tight with effort, as if holding herself still required more strength than most people spent in a day. The restraint bands around her wrists and upper arms glowed faintly where they met her skin, reading motion and responding to it with a silent pulse of corrective pressure. Ethan hated those too. He moved slowly, keeping his hands where she could see them. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said, pitching his voice the way he did with trauma patients and frightened children, calm enough to borrow, steady enough to lean on. "I am a doctor. I am here to treat you." For a second she only stared, silver-violet eyes bright against the flush spreading beneath the blue-green tone of her skin. Then her mouth parted with visible effort. "You should not be here," she whispered. Her voice sounded scraped raw, like each word had to pass through pain on its way out. "That is probably true," Ethan said. "But I am here anyway." He reached the bedside monitor and scanned the feed more closely. The numbers were unstable in a pattern that would have looked like equipment failure to someone less stubborn, but there was a rhythm hiding under the chaos. Her heart rate surged, dropped, then tried to compensate. Her temperature stayed dangerously high. Her oxygen level dipped every time the silver light beneath her skin intensified near her chest. Ethan glanced at the external chart projected at the foot of the bed and frowned. Most of it was incomplete, filled with warnings instead of medicine. No baseline anatomy map. No biochemical panel worth trusting. Half the observations read like fear translated into clinical language. He picked up the handheld scanner, adjusted it to broad spectrum, and passed it slowly over her sternum. Valen flinched hard enough to make the monitor chirp. Ethan stopped immediately. "All right," he said, softer now. "There it is. That is where it hurts." She closed her eyes for half a second, not in confirmation so much as resignation. "Do not let them open it," she breathed. "Please." That word hit him harder than the alarms had. Outside the chamber, he could see blurred figures beyond the glass, shadows shifting, waiting for him to fail. Ethan kept his attention on the patient in front of him. "No one is doing anything without me understanding what is happening first." He angled the scanner again, this time slower, using the lowest active setting. A shape appeared beneath the readout, metallic but not mechanical in any design he recognized, branching outward from a central node nestled against the tissue near her heart. It looked less like an implant and more like something that had rooted there. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. "Mila," he called through the glass without looking away, "I need a clean diagnostic board, thermal suppressants, and a full analog kit. No autodosers." Through the intercom came a stunned pause. "Doctor, command said no direct intervention until clearance arrives." Ethan watched another wave of pain pass through Valen and saw how hard she worked not to cry out. "Then command can come sign the death certificate themselves," he said. He set the scanner down, gently pulled a rolling stool beside the bed, and sat so he was level with her instead of towering over her. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something almost private. "Listen to me. I do not know what they told you about this place. I do not know what they told this colony about you. But right now, none of that matters more than getting you through the next 10 minutes. Can you do that with me?" Valen looked at him as though the question itself was unfamiliar. Her breathing trembled, then steadied by a fraction. After a moment, she gave the smallest nod. It was not trust yet. It was something more fragile than trust. It was permission. Permission changed the room. Not the heat, not the alarms, not the red light washing the chamber walls in slow pulses, but something quieter than all of it. Ethan felt it in the way Valen stopped fighting the restraint bands for half a breath and let her head rest against a pillow as if she had decided, for the moment, not to spend what little strength she had left resisting him. Outside the glass, motion picked up. Mila appeared with an analog case pressed against her hip and a diagnostic board balanced in both hands, while one of the guards argued into a comm unit with the sharp, clipped posture of somebody passing responsibility upward as fast as possible. Ethan rose, crossed to the supply hatch, and keyed it open from the inside. "Set it there," he said when Mila slid the equipment through. She hesitated just long enough to meet his eyes. Fear was still there, but now it shared space with something else, something more useful. "There is more," she said quietly through the intercom. The file came down from command. Ethan looked toward the outer console. A secure packet flashed in amber on the screen. Authorization tier, restricted. Incident archive attached. He should have waited. He knew that. He should have focused only on the numbers in front of him, on temperature, pulse, respiratory distress, and whatever was rooted near Valen's heart. But medicine had taught him that bodies were honest only until politics got hold of them. After that, truth had to be dug out like shrapnel. He opened the packet. A holographic record unfolded over the console in layers of dense text and blurred surveillance stills. Species designation unresolved. Hazard classification provisional. Survivor accounts inconsistent. Ethan scanned line after line, his exhaustion burning away under a colder kind of focus. Outer settlement panic event. Communications blackout. Civilian collapse cluster. Environmental contamination feared, later unconfirmed. Subject transferred under martial authority. Then the language shifted. Not clinical. Protective. Redacted sections blocked with neat black bars. Timestamps missing. 2 separate physician assessments removed. 1 recommendation sealed. Ethan tapped deeper and found a fragment of the original intake note, 1 sentence left and censored by mistake. Subject presents with implanted foreign structure and severe regulatory distress. Treat as host, not source. Ethan stared at the line until he could feel his own heartbeat in his teeth. Host, not source. Someone had known from the beginning. Someone high enough to bury it had chosen fear over fact and let the whole colony build a legend around a girl in medical crisis. "What are they saying?" Valen asked. He turned back to her. Even now, even barely conscious, she had read the change in his face. Ethan crossed to the bed and lowered the diagnostic board into position beside her. "They are saying a lot of things," he said. "Most of them are written by people who were more interested in control than accuracy." A shadow fell across the glass. A woman in a dark field coat had arrived outside the chamber, silver insignia at her collar catching the light. Chief Marshal Nora Hayes. Ethan recognized her from emergency briefings and quarantine drills, the kind of official who never raised her voice because she never had to. She keyed the intercom live. "Dr. Carter, step out of the room." Ethan did not even look up from the board as he connected the first analog leads by hand. "She is unstable. She is under martial jurisdiction," Nora said. "And you are operating beyond approved protocol." Ethan checked Valen's pupils, then the silver light threading beneath her skin, then the impossible scan outline branching under her sternum like metal roots in living tissue. "Then update the protocol," he said. Silence pressed against the glass for a beat. Valen watched him through half-lidded eyes, her expression dazed but intent, as though she was trying to understand what kind of man answered power like that in a room like this. Ethan picked up the thermal suppressant, glanced once more at the corrupted file hovering over the console, and felt the story in the room sharpen into something dangerous in an entirely different way. The colony had not been afraid of what Valen was. It had been taught to fear what had been done to her. The most dangerous thing in the room was no longer the patient on the bed but the silence gathering behind the glass. Chief Marshal Nora Hayes stood with one hand braced on the outer console, her face calm in the way trained authority usually was, but Ethan could see tension in the set of her jaw and the stillness of her shoulders. She was not afraid of losing control of the room. She was afraid of what would happen if control slipped for even a second. "Dr. Carter," she said through the intercom, each word clipped clean, "this is your final warning. Step away from the subject and exit the chamber." Ethan slid the thermal suppressant patch across Valen's collarbone and watched the monitor react almost immediately. Her temperature eased by 0.5 degrees. Not much, but enough to prove the simplest thing in the room: she could still be helped. "She is not a subject," he said. "She is a patient." Nora's eyes narrowed a fraction. "You do not have access to the full context." "Neither did the staff who wrote half these panic notes," Ethan replied. He tapped the frozen intake line still hovering on the console outside. "Treat as host, not source." Somebody did know the full context, though. They just buried it. For the first time, something flickered across Nora's face. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. It vanished so fast most people would have missed it. Ethan did not. Behind him, Valen drew in a shallow breath that trembled on the way out. He turned back to her and saw sweat shining along her temples under the red emergency light. Up close, the silver currents under her skin looked less like something supernatural and more like damage trying to survive in plain sight. "Stay with me," he said quietly. He reached for her wrist, careful around the restraint band, and counted the pulse himself because the monitor kept stumbling over rhythms it did not understand. Too fast. Then too thin. Then fast again. Her eyes opened slowly, trying to focus on him through the haze of fever. "You found it," she murmured. "The thing inside." Ethan kept his voice level. "I found enough to know this is not what they claimed." A tired, fragile expression crossed her face, something close to grief and older than the room around them. "They will still choose the easier story," she whispered. Outside, Nora spoke again, but her voice had changed. The hard edge had softened into something almost weary. "Doctor, if that device breaches, this entire wing goes into permanent containment. I am trying to prevent a panic." Ethan looked up at her through the barrier. "No. You are trying to manage one that already happened." The words hung between them. Mila stood a few feet behind the marshal, clutching her tablet to her chest, her eyes moving from Ethan to Valen and back again as if she could feel the room splitting along a line nobody else had wanted to name. Ethan returned his attention to the diagnostic board and rerouted the sensor array manually. The image sharpened. Metallic branches extended from the central mass in delicate filaments, threaded through tissue with terrifying precision, not invading so much as anchoring. He had seen battlefield implants, neuroassists, black market graphs, and emergency regulators held together by hope and cheap solder. This was none of those. This had been designed for permanence. Valen watched his face as he studied the scan. "Do not let them cut blindly," she said, each word barely more than breath. "If they disturb the core without cooling it first, it will think I am dying." Ethan stilled. "Think?" Her gaze shifted toward the branching shape on the board, then back to him. "It does not know the difference between saving me and using me." A faint chill moved through Ethan despite the overheated room. He glanced once at Nora, once at the red warnings pulsing across the glass, then at the exhausted girl bound to the bed like a disaster instead of a life. In that moment the case stopped being a quarantine problem, a jurisdiction fight, or even a medical mystery. It became something much simpler and much harder. Somebody had built fear into her body and called it protection. For a few seconds Ethan did not move. The monitors kept up their thin, restless chorus, red warning bands crawled across the glass, and beyond the chamber wall he could feel Chief Marshal Nora Hayes waiting for him to make the wrong choice so she could take the decision out of his hands. Valen lay beneath the lights with her breathing caught in shallow, uneven pulls, her skin flushed with fever, the silver filaments beneath it brightening in pulses that matched neither the heart monitor nor any human rhythm Ethan knew. The room had been arranged for control, not care. Too much light. Too much noise. Too many systems treating distress like defiance. He looked up at the ceiling panels, then at the restraint indicators, then at the sound level display blinking amber near the bed. "Mila," he said through the intercom, "I need auxiliary lights only. Kill the upper banks and mute every non-critical alarm in this chamber." Nora answered before Mila could. "Doctor, this is not a comfort suite." Ethan did not look at her. "No, Marshall. It is a medical room, which means the goal is to keep the patient alive." There was a beat of silence, and then, to his mild surprise, the harsh white ceiling lights dimmed in stages until only the lower wall strips and the soft diagnostic glow remained. The chamber changed instantly. The red glare faded into cooler shadows. The sharp shine on the metal rails softened. Valen's eyelids fluttered, and for the first time since he entered, the tightness at the corners of her eyes eased by the smallest fraction. Ethan reached to the monitor bank and manually silenced the escalating tone that kept chiming every time her pulse slipped outside human parameters. The quiet that followed was not complete, but it was kinder. He had learned a long time ago that half of emergency medicine was chemistry and skill, and the other half was convincing a frightened body that the world had stopped trying to attack it. "Better?" he asked. Valen did not answer at first. Her lips parted, then closed again. Finally she gave the faintest nod. It was so slight most people would have missed it. Ethan did not. He turned to the storage cabinet built into the far wall, found a thermal recovery blanket, and shook it open with a soft crackle. The silver fabric caught the chamber light like water. When he laid it over her shoulders and upper chest, careful to avoid the worst of the implanted heat near her sternum, her whole body reacted with a tremor that was less fear than surprise. "There," he said quietly. "No needles for the next minute. No guessing. We are going to lower the strain first." Outside the glass, he could sense disapproval radiating off the security team, but Mila had stepped closer, tablet forgotten at her side, watching not like a frightened staffer now but like a nurse remembering what the job was supposed to be. Ethan adjusted the blanket so it tucked gently along Valen's arms without pressing the restraint lines. He lowered the fan setting in the chamber because the circulating air had been too cold and too fast, drying her skin and driving her deeper into stress. Then he moved the rolling scanner away from the bed by a foot, enough to stop its cooling motor from vibrating through the frame. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind people mocked when they wanted medicine to look dramatic instead of human. Valen's breathing began to lengthen by degrees. Still fragile, still shallow, but no longer breaking apart on every inhale. The silver light beneath her skin dimmed from a frantic flicker to a slower, steadier glow near her throat. Ethan sat beside her again so she would not have to search the room for him. "I am not going to force your body into a human pattern," he said. "We work with what it is actually doing." Her gaze found his through the softer light, confusion moving across her face first, then something that looked painfully close to disbelief. "You changed the room," she whispered. Ethan glanced at the muted panels, the lowered lights, the blanket gathered at her shoulders. "I changed what was making it worse." Valen swallowed with effort. "No one has done that before." The words landed in the chamber heavier than any alarm. Ethan did not trust himself to answer right away. Outside the glass, even Nora had gone still. For one long moment there was nothing in the room except the low hum of hospital systems, the faint rustle of thermal fabric, and the fragile steadiness of a patient who had stopped shaking because someone had finally treated her pain like pain instead of proof. Once Valen stopped shaking, the room began telling the truth. Ethan had seen it happen before with patients everyone else thought were unstable, difficult, dramatic, dangerous. Lower the noise, lower the fear, and suddenly the body stopped screaming long enough to be understood. He angled the diagnostic board closer and switched from automated interpretation to raw signal display. The lines across the screen steadied just enough for a pattern to emerge. Her heart rhythm was not failing at random. It was reacting. Every spike in the implanted structure's output came half a beat after a surge in stress. Not before. After. Ethan leaned in, eyes moving between the board and the faint silver currents under her skin. It is mirroring your distress, he said, mostly to himself. Not causing it first. Amplifying it. Valen watched him through exhausted eyes. It listens for threat, she whispered. Then it becomes one. Ethan looked at her sharply. Who told you that? A shadow of something moved across her face, not quite fear, not quite memory, but close enough to both that he felt it in his chest. The people who put it there did not use words like people should. The chamber seemed to contract around that sentence. Outside the glass, Nora did not interrupt, but Ethan could feel her listening now with the kind of stillness that meant every answer was becoming more dangerous than the last. He turned back to the board and opened the analog chemistry kit. Mila had brought him. No autodosers. No species assumptions. Just manual strips, microvials, thermal readers, and a field spectrometer old enough to be trustworthy. Valen, he said, keeping his voice low and even, I need you to tell me exactly what happens before the pain gets worse. Not what everyone else sees. What you feel. She shut her eyes, gathering herself. Heat first, she said after a moment. Behind the bone here. She shifted her chin weakly toward the center of her chest. Then sound becomes sharp. Light feels wrong. My heart races. The device thinks I am under attack and starts to wake. Ethan nodded slowly. Every word matched what he was seeing. And when they treat you? Her mouth tightened. Most medicines make it believe my body is failing. Then it tries to keep me alive. Ethan let out a breath through his nose. By doing what? This time she did not answer right away. Her gaze slid toward the reinforced glass, toward the staff outside, toward a world that had already decided what kind of creature she was. By choosing survival over everyone nearby. Mila made a small sound outside the chamber, more shocked than afraid now. Ethan did not look away from Valen. Has it ever responded when you were calm? She gave the faintest shake of her head against the pillow. Not calm. Safe. The word settled into him with quiet force. Safe. Not sedated. Not contained. Not restrained. Safe. Ethan turned back to the diagnostic board and ran a cool spectrum scan along the branching outline around the implant. The readings sharpened. The metallic filaments were wrapped through living tissue with horrifying elegance, but the surrounding inflammation had dropped since he dimmed the lights and reduced the chamber stressors. That was the first real break he had gotten all night. Mila, he called through the intercom, pull every suppressant in stock that lowers neural heat without depressing cardiac function. Human, non-human, veterinary, I do not care. And get me archived xenomedical references on adaptive defense implants. On it, she said, already moving. Nora's voice came a second later, quieter than before. Doctor, if you are right, then every forced intervention before this may have made her worse. Ethan kept his eyes on the monitor, on the numbers finally beginning to line up with reason instead of fear. Yes, he said. And if we keep treating her like a weapon, that is exactly what the device will keep trying to be. Valen looked at him as if she had spent too long waiting for someone to reach that obvious, devastating conclusion. Then, with the blanket gathered at her shoulders and the room no longer trying to punish her for being afraid, she whispered the most human thing Ethan had heard all night. I am so tired of surviving people. The word stayed with Ethan long after Valen closed her eyes again. I am so tired of surviving people. There was nothing dramatic in the way she said it, no anger sharpened for effect, no plea shaped to win sympathy. Just exhaustion. Honest, stripped down, almost too quiet for the room that heard it. Ethan had spent enough years in emergency medicine to know that the calmest sentences were often the ones built on the heaviest pain. He adjusted the edge of the thermal blanket where it had slipped from her shoulder, then turned back to the diagnostic board as Mila hurried through the outer doors with a stack of old reference slates tucked against her chest. She moved differently now. Less fear, more purpose. That alone told him the room had changed more than anybody wanted to admit. I pulled everything I could find from archived xenomedical storage, she said through the intercom, breathing a little hard. Adaptive defense systems, biosymbiotic regulators, trauma implants from frontier conflicts, and one prohibited research paper from 22 years ago that definitely should not have been easy to access. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. You are becoming my favorite person in this building. That is a low bar tonight, Mila said. Even Nora did not object. The marshal stood with her arms folded now, her earlier certainty worn thinner by every new fact the chamber forced into the open. Ethan scanned the first slate Mila pushed through the hatch and felt his pulse pick up for an entirely different reason. There it was. Not identical, but close enough to matter. A classified military support organism designed to bond with host tissue, detect catastrophic threat states, and deploy environmental countermeasures before the host could die. Not a weapon by primary intent. A living emergency system built with the kind of cold logic that always looked merciful on paper and monstrous in a frightened crowd. Side effects listed in careful bureaucratic language. Severe thermal surges, autonomic instability, sensory overload, catastrophic defensive escalation under repeated perceived hostility. Ethan read the line twice, then looked up at Nora through the glass. They built a panic-reactive survival engine into her body. Nora did not answer immediately. In the hall behind her, security traffic had thickened. More boots. More radios. Someone from administration had arrived, then another. The whole wing had started to feel the spread of knowledge the way dry air feels a coming storm. Before Nora could speak, a deep chime rolled through the corridor outside, followed by the murmur of voices rising all at once. Not staff voices. Civilians. Ethan frowned. What is that? Mila turned toward the hall, her face draining of color. Word got out, she said. Somebody in intake leaked the transfer log. There are people gathering outside the hospital. Through the reinforced exterior monitors above the console, Ethan caught fractured images from the front plaza. Floodlights cutting through the colony night. Parkas, work jackets, dust-stained boots. Faces lifted toward the building with the hard, frightened look of people who had already decided what they were looking at. No weapons that he could see. No riot charge. Just fear in numbers, which was sometimes worse because it always thought it was reasonable. Chants began, muffled by distance and glass but clear enough in rhythm to turn the hall colder than the chamber itself. Send her out. Send her out. Valen's eyes opened at once. Ethan saw the change ripple through her before a single number on the monitor could catch up. Her pulse jumped. The silver light under her skin brightened near her collarbone. Her breathing shortened, not from fever this time but recognition. The body remembered what crowds meant. Ethan moved back to her bedside immediately. Do not look at them, he said. Look at me. Outside, Nora's head turned toward the plaza feed, and for the first time all night the authority in her face gave way to something more human and far less comfortable. Shame. Ethan pulled the privacy shield across the lower half of the glass, cutting off the worst of the movement from Valen's view, then rested one hand lightly on the rail beside her so she could anchor to a fixed point in the room. You are here, he said, steady and low. You are not out there. They do not get to tell your body what tonight becomes. But even as he said it, he knew the colony already had. Fear had reached the building before the truth ever did. The chant outside rolled through the hospital walls in low, uneven waves, more felt than heard now that Ethan had drawn the privacy shield and muted the external feed. Even so, the room knew. Fear had a way of changing the temperature without touching the thermostat. Valen's pulse still ran too high under his fingers, but it was no longer climbing blindly. He kept his hand on the bed rail, close enough for her to track without forcing contact, and watched the silver light beneath her skin flare once, then settle into a weaker shimmer along her throat. "That sound means they remember," she said after a long moment. Her voice was hoarse from fever and strain, but steadier than before. Ethan glanced toward the sealed glass, then back at her. "People are very good at remembering the wrong version of a story," he said. Something like a tired breath passed through her, almost a laugh if laughter had forgotten how to be light. "On my world," she murmured, "we used to say memory is a room with poor lighting. Everyone thinks they saw clearly." Ethan let that sit between them. It was too good a line to belong to a monster. He pulled the stool a little closer and lowered himself into it so he would not tower over her. Outside the chamber, Mila had gone back to sorting reference slates while Nora took a call in the corridor with her back half turned, buying them the illusion of privacy if not the real thing. Inside, the softened lights threw pale blue reflections across the blanket gathered at Valen's shoulders, and for the first time since he met her, the room felt less like containment and more like a place where a person might be allowed to exist. "You said people are calling you Valen," Ethan said gently. "Is that your name?" Her eyes drifted to the ceiling for a second, following some distant point above the lights. "It is the name they were given to record," she said. "It is not the first one I had." Ethan waited. He had learned patience the hard way, from frightened children in burn units, from grieving parents in triage halls, from old men who needed 10 full minutes before they could answer a simple question because the truth hurt on the way out. Valen swallowed, and when she spoke again her voice had changed. Softer. Further away. Before the frontier stations. Before the transport chains. Before all of this, my name was Ilya. Ethan repeated it quietly so she could hear how it sounded in a human mouth. Ilya. Her eyes closed briefly. My mother used to sing it from the kitchen terrace at dusk so I would know when to come home. The image landed with such ordinary warmth that Ethan felt the hospital disappear for a second. Not the alarms. Not the crowd. Just a terrace somewhere under a different sky and a voice calling someone loved enough to be expected at dinner. "You had a family," he said. It was a foolish sentence. Of course she had. But the colony had built its fear so thoroughly around her that even obvious things sounded newly sacred once spoken aloud. "I had a mother with bright hands," Valen said, staring now not at him but through him, into memory. "She worked with glass that held color even in darkness. My brother repaired weather kites. My father collected old songs and pretended he was not sentimental enough to cry during them." Her mouth trembled once, then steadied. "I sang before the war. In public squares. In market halls. In the waiting chambers for travelers. Nothing important. Just songs people liked to carry home with them." Ethan could not stop himself from picturing it. The same woman everyone outside wanted gone, standing under open air and light, singing to strangers who had not yet learned to be afraid. He looked at the branching shadow of the implant on the diagnostic board, then back at her face, and the cruelty of the transformation nearly took his breath. "I am sorry," he said. Valen turned her head toward him. "For what?" "For how thoroughly they erased the girl before they met the patient." For the first time all night, something in her expression loosened into unmistakable sadness without fear hardening around it. "You hear her," she whispered. Ethan held her gaze and did not look away. "Yes," he said. "I do." And outside the chamber, beyond the glass, beyond the crowd, beyond the file that had tried to turn a life into a warning label, Chief Marshal. Nora Hayes slowly lowered her comm unit and stood very still, as if she had just remembered that the person in the bed had once belonged to a home. For a moment, no one in the chamber moved. The hospital air carried its usual mix of sterilizer vapor, warm circuitry, and recycled oxygen, but underneath it Ethan could feel something shifting that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with truth getting close enough to be recognized. Valen, or Ilya, lay under the softened lights with the thermal blanket gathered around her shoulders, her breathing still uneven but no longer tearing itself apart. Outside the privacy shield, Mila's fingers moved quickly across an old reference slate, her brow drawn tight in concentration. Then she stopped. Ethan knew that kind of stillness. It was the silence of somebody finding the page they were not supposed to find. "Doctor," she said through the intercom, and her voice had gone almost flat with disbelief, "you need to see this." He rose from the stool and crossed to the hatch while she slid the slate through. The file on its surface was old enough to predate the hospital's current operating system, tagged with defense coding and a medical waiver stamped by Emergency Colonial Authority. Ethan scanned the opening lines and felt the room narrow around him. Frontier Settlement 12. Atmospheric breach event. Unknown particulate cascade. Civilian exposure estimate, catastrophic. Experimental host adaptation protocol authorized under survival exception. There was no dramatic language, no admission of cruelty, no line that said a life had been taken apart and redesigned for the convenience of frightened officials. Bureaucracy rarely spoke that plainly. It did something colder. It used phrases like volunteer status pending verification and non-recoverable alternatives and population preservation priority. Ethan read deeper. The adaptive organism in Ilya's chest had not been built to hunt. It had been built to absorb and neutralize an airborne xenotoxic agent spreading through the settlement years earlier. It had succeeded. The host survived. The colony survived. Then the host developed unstable defense responses due to repeated environmental hostility and unauthorized containment measures. Ethan looked up so sharply the back of his neck ached. "She saved them," he said. Nora did not answer, but he did not need words to read the truth on her face. Mila made a small, broken sound outside the glass. Valen opened her eyes, watching him with the exhausted stillness of someone who already knew what the documents would say because her own body had been forced to remember it every day since. Ethan turned one page farther and found the line that made his stomach drop. Public narrative adjustment recommended to prevent unrest. Fear had not simply happened around her. It had been managed. Curated. Federal. The colony had nearly died from something unseen in the air, and when one altered girl carried the price of their survival in her chest, somebody decided it would be easier to call her dangerous than to explain what had been done. "Tell me I am reading this wrong," Ethan said without taking his eyes off the file. Nora stepped to the glass at last, and when she spoke, the authority in her voice had thinned into something harder to listen to. "You are reading the part they kept," she said. "Not the part they buried." Ethan turned toward her fully now. "Then say it." Nora held his gaze for a long second, as if every year since the settlement incident had led her unwillingly to this one room. "The toxic cascade should have killed thousands," she said quietly. "The protocol was supposed to be temporary. The host was supposed to be stabilized, honored, relocated, and protected. Instead the secondary reactions frightened people. There were surges. Containment failures. Panic. Administration decided gratitude would not hold the colony together nearly as well as a monster story." The words settled over the chamber like ash. Ethan looked back at Ilya and felt something inside him break cleanly in two, not from shock but from the terrible simplicity of it. They had turned the girl who saved them into the thing they needed saved from. Ilya watched his face, and when she spoke her voice was so soft he nearly missed it over the hum of the wall panels. "I told you," she said. "They chose the easier story." The truth did not make the room louder. It made it unbearably still. Ethan stood with the old defense file in his hand, the faded lines of bureaucratic language glowing pale against the diagnostic board, and felt the kind of anger that arrived without heat. Cold, precise, almost clean. The kind that sharpened rather than burned. Outside the chamber, the chants from the plaza still pulsed through the building in distant waves, but now every voice out there sounded less like fear and more like theft. They had taken a girl who survived the impossible, used her to keep a colony breathing, then handed the story back to the public with all the humanity cut out of it. Ilya lay beneath the softened lights watching him with the calm exhaustion of someone who had already made peace with being disbelieved. That, more than anything, made his chest ache. People should never have to become this used to injustice. Nora's comm unit vibrated at her collar. She glanced at the screen, and the change in her expression was small enough most people would have missed it. Ethan did not. Her mouth flattened. Her shoulders locked. She turned slightly away from the glass and answered in a voice too low for the room to hear, but he did not need the words. He knew an order when he saw one land. A few seconds later she ended the call and stood with her hand still resting on the comm unit as if it had suddenly grown heavier. Mila looked from Nora to Ethan, already sensing the shape of what was coming. "Marshal," Ethan said, "what did they just tell you to do?" Nora did not answer immediately. When she finally met his eyes, there was no authority left in the look she gave him, only a tired kind of honesty. "Administrative Command has classified the patient as a catastrophic liability," she said. "They are issuing a full shutdown of this wing. Communications blackout. File purge. Transfer of custody to off-site containment." Ethan stared at her. "Containment?" Nora's voice dropped another degree. "Permanent." The word hit the chamber like a sudden drop in pressure. Mila stepped back from the console as if the air itself had gone wrong. "No," she said, before she could stop herself. "You cannot mean that." Nora looked older than she had 10 minutes ago. "The crowd outside is growing. Colonial leadership thinks if the records disappear and the patient disappears with them, the panic will collapse before sunrise." Ethan let out one sharp breath through his nose and set the file down before he crushed the slate in his hand. "So their answer to the truth is to erase the witness." "Their answer," Nora said quietly, "is to survive the morning." Ethan turned toward Ilya. The silver glow beneath her skin had dimmed again, but her face had gone still in a way that told him she had heard enough. Not every word. Enough. There was no surprise in her expression. Only that same old exhaustion, the kind built by repeated proof that people would rather protect a lie than a person. "How long?" Ethan asked without looking away from her. Nora checked the time on her wrist display. 8 minutes until systems lockout. After that, I lose discretionary authority. Mila made a helpless sound. "Doctor, if they purge the files, everything you found is gone." Ethan crossed back to the bedside and looked at the board, the implant scan, the manual notes he had entered, the old military record, the temperature trend finally improving because someone had bothered to treat the patient like a patient. All of it fragile. All of it seconds away from being deleted by people who had never sat in this room and listened. He rested one hand lightly on the bed rail. "Then we do not wait for their version of mercy," he said. Ilya turned her face toward him, searching his expression with those tired silver-violet eyes. "What are you going to do, doctor?" she asked. Ethan looked once at Nora, once at the locked hatch, once at the countdown clock beginning to pulse at the corner of the console, and when he answered his voice was calm enough to sound inevitable. "I am going to make sure you are still here when the lie runs out of places to hide." The countdown in the corner of the console turned from steady amber to a harder, pulsing red, each second marking itself with silent precision that somehow felt louder than the chants outside. 7 minutes, 42 seconds. Ethan moved before fear could waste any more time. He stripped the chamber down to what mattered, shoving aside every automated tray and protocol prompt that assumed a human body and a compliance system. "Mila, I need full manual access to the implant scan, local backup only, and every cooling gel pack this wing has left," he said. "Not cryo. Controlled thermal reduction." Mila was already moving. "Done." Nora did not step away from the glass. She watched him with the expression of someone standing on the last thin line between duty and conscience. "If you open that interface," she said, "you may trigger the entire survival lattice." Ethan kept his hand steady as he unsealed a sterile pack and laid out analog tools one by one across the bedside tray. No blades. No guesswork. Fiber probes, thermal pads, neural dampers, a field bridge small enough to slip beneath the scan port without waking the deeper branches. Then I do not open it like a surgeon chasing a foreign object, he said. I approach it like a system that has spent years being punished for doing the only thing it was designed to do. Ilya watched him through the softened light, her face pale beneath the blue-green glow of her skin, silver currents shifting faintly under the surface of her throat. It will feel intent, she murmured. It always does. Ethan looked at her as he snapped on a fresh pair of gloves. Then I need you to hear mine. I am not trying to remove you from it tonight. I am trying to convince it that you do not have to fight. The word sounded impossible even to him, but impossible had become the most honest language in the room. Outside the chamber, the hall lights flickered once. Then again. Mila glanced up sharply. They are beginning the wing shutdown, she said. Systems are transferring authority away from local control. Ethan exhaled slowly. Nora. The marshal met his eyes. How much can you still delay? Her jaw tightened. 3 minutes on the security lock. Maybe 4 if they think I am containing you instead of helping you. Ethan nodded once. It was enough. He turned back to the bed and lowered the diagnostic array over Ilya's sternum. The branching shape of the implant glowed in layered blue-white lines above her, beautiful in the cold, terrible way some machinery was when it had forgotten mercy. He placed the first cooling pad just above the central node, then another lower along the branching heat path. The monitor changed immediately, not dramatically, just enough to matter. Surface temperature dropped 1 degree. Neural agitation eased. Good, Ethan said, more to the system than to the room. That is all I need. One good decision at a time. Ilya's eyes stayed on his face. You talk to it as if it can understand you. Ethan adjusted the field bridge and began lowering its signal in increments so small the display barely registered them. Everything in medicine understands something. He said. Pain. Relief. Threat. Safety. The trick is figuring out which language it trusts. Beyond the glass, heavy boots approached at a run. Security. Not Nora's people. Administrative response. Mila paled but did not move from her console. Nora stepped into the corridor and the chamber door feed went dark as she blocked the line of sight. Ethan heard raised voices through the insulation, sharp and urgent, then the dull thud of hands on external panels. The hospital around them had become a machine trying to close its fist. Inside the room, Ethan kept lowering the bridge signal 1 fraction at a time. The implant's core brightened, then steadied, as if listening. Ilya inhaled sharply, fingers tightening against the restraint line. It knows, she whispered. Yes, Ethan said, leaning closer, eyes fixed on the readout. And for the first time in a long while, I think it knows we are not here to hurt you. The next pulse across the monitor came back cleaner than any they had seen all night. For 1 fragile second, the room felt it too. Not victory. Not yet. But the shape of a way through. The cleaner pulse lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to prove Ethan had been right. The implant was not hungry for destruction. It was desperate for certainty. Given less threat, less noise, less force, it chose stability over escalation. He watched the core brightness settle into a narrower band on the display and felt hope rise so sharply it almost hurt. Then the chamber lights flickered again, harder this time, and every monitor in the room flashed a system warning in cold white letters. Central override in 30 seconds. Mila inhaled so fast Ethan heard it through the intercom. They are taking local control now, she said. If they lock us out, the files vanish with the network partition. Outside the darkened door feed, voices collided in muffled bursts. Nora had stopped pretending to delay the inevitable. She was choosing whether to surrender to it. Ethan kept one hand steady on the field bridge while the other adjusted the cooling sequence by fractions of a degree. Mila, he said, never taking his eyes off the readout, is there any public channel they cannot shut in under 30 seconds? Emergency patient broadcast, she answered instantly. It mirrors to every station screen in the hospital, the triage bays, the plaza boards, and any civilian device logged into colony health alerts. It is designed for evacuation orders. Ethan looked up. Can it carry video and records? Mila's face changed as the idea landed. Yes. Nora stepped back into view beyond the glass, breath slightly uneven, field coat pulled askew from whatever argument had just taken place in the corridor. For 1 second she looked at the chamber, at Ilya on the bed, at Ethan bent over the diagnostic board, at the old defense file glowing on the outer console, and he saw the exact moment she stopped serving the lie. She moved to Mila's station, keyed in her marshal authorization, and the network barriers on the console began falling away like locked doors opening in sequence. Marshal? Mila whispered. Nora did not look at her. Upload everything, she said. The intake note. The original protocol. The defense archive. The live medical feed. All of it. Ethan felt the room tip into a different kind of danger. Not the danger of the implant, or the crowd, or the shutdown order. The danger of truth becoming too visible to bury. Mila's hands flew across the controls. Screen after screen lit across the outer hall. Then the chamber wall opposite Ethan brightened as the emergency broadcast mirrored internally. A hospital logo flashed once, vanished, and was replaced by Ilya's live vitals, the scan of the branching implant in her chest, and the recovered file text in stark, undeniable lines. Host, not source. Colony Survival Protocol. Public narrative adjustment recommended to prevent unrest. Outside the hospital, the chants in the plaza did not stop all at once. They frayed. One voice dropped, then another, then an entire wave of sound seemed to hesitate and fold in on itself. On the external monitor above Mila's station, Ethan caught glimpses of faces turned upward toward the public screens. Men in dust jackets. Women with children tucked against their sides. Dock workers, miners, transport clerks, half the sleepless colony staring at the same lines of text and the same image of the girl they had feared, not raging, not attacking, just lying in a hospital bed while a human doctor tried to keep her alive. Mila pushed the final archive live, including the military waiver and the line that mattered most. The host survived. The colony survived. Ilya saw the reflected light from the broadcast. Moving across the ceiling and turned her head weakly toward Ethan. What did you do? She asked. He swallowed once before answering. I stopped letting them speak for you. On the plaza feed, a little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed at the screen. Nearby, an older man removed his cap and held it against his chest without seeming to know he had done it. In the hall outside Isolation Wing C, every staff monitor now carried the same truth, and no one moved fast anymore. Even fear, once it saw itself clearly, seemed to lose the strength to shout. Nora stood at the console with her shoulders squared and her eyes shining in the sterile blue light, watching the colony learn in real time that the life they had called a nightmare had once been the reason they were still breathing at all. And in the chamber, as the cleaner pulse returned again across the monitor, Ethan looked at Ilya and realized the lie had finally broken where it mattered most first, in the hearts of the people who could no longer pretend they had been afraid of a monster when all along they had been looking at a sacrifice. When the final override timer hit 0, nothing shut down. The records were already everywhere. The truth had moved too far and too fast to be stuffed back into a sealed file or buried beneath another official phrase. In Isolation Wing C, the monitors stayed live, the chamber stayed warm, and the cleaner rhythm on Ethan's screen held steady enough for him to believe in it. Not perfect. Not safe enough to relax. But real. He eased the field bridge down one last fraction and watched the central node in Ilya's chest respond with something close to acceptance. The silver light beneath her skin softened from a hard, reactive brightness into a pale inner glow that no longer looked like a warning. It looked like survival without panic. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding for most of the night. His shoulders ached. His eyes burned. His scrub top clung damply between his shoulder blades. He had never felt more tired, or more certain that staying had been the only decent thing to do. Outside the glass, nobody was shouting anymore. The corridor beyond Nora and Mila had gone still in. That rare hospital way that only happened after a code ended or a truth landed too hard for immediate speech. Staff members stood in small, silent clusters staring at the public screens, then at the chamber, then back at the screens as if they needed to compare the official words to the patient on the bed and could not quite forgive themselves for how different the two had been. Nora slowly keyed the outer lock open and stepped inside for the first time that night. Without the barrier between them, she looked less like a marshal and more like a woman who had spent too many years carrying an order she had mistaken for necessity. She stopped a respectful distance from the bed. Ilya watched her with calm, exhausted eyes. Nora opened her mouth once, closed it, then tried again. There should have been honor, she said quietly. There should have been protection. I am sorry for what we let fear become. Ilya studied her for a long moment, not kindly and not cruelly either, just with the heavy patience of someone who had learned that apologies arrived later than they should. You were not the first, she whispered. Try very hard not to be the last. Nora bowed her head. It was a small movement, but in the silence of the chamber it felt as solemn as any ceremony. Mila stepped in next with a fresh warm saline bag and eyes red-rimmed from strain or shame or both. She changed the line with careful hands, then tucked the edge of the thermal blanket more securely around Ilya's shoulders in a gesture so ordinary and gentle it nearly undid Ethan. There it was again, the whole point of everything, hidden in the smallest thing. Care, when finally offered, looked embarrassingly simple. An hour later, when the first gray hint of colony dawn began touching the upper windows of the hospital, Ethan unlocked the restraint bands one by one. No alarms followed. No surge. No crisis. Ilya did not lunge or recoil or become the nightmare half the building had once prepared for. She simply lay there for a moment with her freed hands resting on the blanket, as if even the absence of pressure was something her body needed time to understand. Ethan adjusted the transport gurney himself and helped guide her onto it with the kind of caution usually reserved for glass, relics, and sacred things. When the chamber doors finally opened to the hall, the people waiting outside stepped back without being told. Not in fear this time. In respect. In grief. In the plaza feed still running over the nurses' station, the crowd outside the hospital had thinned into quiet pockets of people who no longer seemed to know where to put their hands. Some stood with heads lowered. Some simply watched the windows. Near the entrance, a little girl in a puffy blue coat slipped past her father, walked to the security line, and held out a small bunch of white greenhouse flowers with both hands. Nobody stopped her. Nora took the flowers, turned, and placed them gently on the blanket near Ilya's wrist. Ilya looked down at them as if she had forgotten such things could still belong in her world. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then, slowly, one clear tear slid free and disappeared into the silver fabric at her shoulder. Ethan saw it and looked away just enough to give the moment dignity. He kept one hand on the gurney rail as they moved together down the silent hall, past screens still lit with the truth, past staff who no longer met fear with distance, past a night that had begun with a monster story and ended with something far more difficult for a colony to live with. A debt. Overhead, the hospital lights shifted from emergency red to morning white. The air smelled cleaner now, less like warning, more like rain coming through metal vents after a storm. Beside him, Ilya closed her eyes, not from collapse this time but from a weary kind of peace. Ethan guided the gurney toward recovery, and the people on either side